Welcome to episode 6 of our Exodus series. Have you ever heard the word reassurance? It's quite a long word. It's not a word people normally use with children. Yet the word reassurance will help us understand our story today. Sometimes we need reassurance. Imagine you are going to play a match for your sports team. You are on the way in the car with your mum and dad. But, oh no, on the way the car breaks down. You are going to miss the match. You're a bit upset, a bit disappointed. You've practiced all week. Your mum and dad give you a big hug and tell you it's going to be okay. Although you're sad, they help you to see it's not as bad as you think. Your mum and dad reassure you. Sometimes we need someone to help us see that things aren't as bad as they seem. We need someone to reassure us. In our story today, Moses needs reassurance. Remember, it's not going so well for Moses and Yahweh's people. Yahweh's people, the Israelites, are slaves in Egypt. Yahweh sent Moses to Pharaoh with a message from Yahweh. But Pharaoh did not listen to Moses' message. Instead, Pharaoh treated the Israelites even worse than ever. The Israelites even turned against Moses and blamed him for everything getting worse. This is the lowest point of the book of Exodus so far. Moses does not know what to do, so he cries out to God. I'm going to read from Exodus chapter 5, verses 22 to 23. Moses returned to Yahweh and said, "Why, Lord? Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." Moses needs reassurance. Last week, Yahweh began to reassure Moses by showing him that his timing is best. But is that true? Moses needs to be reassured that everything is not as bad as he thinks. Wonderfully, in our story today, Yahweh continues to give Moses the reassurance he needs. This reassurance can be summed up in one word: covenant. If we understand this one word, then we will see how it reassures Moses. So we need to know what a covenant is. When someone makes a promise to you, they might just say, "I promise." For example, a friend might say to you, "I promise I will share my sweets with you after school." That's a nice promise. Some promises are much more important, though. Sometimes, when people make promises, they might write their name on a piece of paper. For example, when an adult starts a new job, they sign their name on a piece of paper called a contract. Their signature shows that they will work hard and do what is right. But a covenant is an even more important promise. A covenant is a super promise. It's the kind of promise you cannot break. It's such an important promise that if you break it, you should die. Back in our story from Exodus, Yahweh reassures Moses by telling him about a covenant, a super promise, that he made with a man called Abraham. Many years ago, hundreds of years before the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, God made a covenant with Abraham. Part of this covenant, this super promise, was that God would give the land of Canaan to Abraham's family. Yahweh said he would give them the promised land. Now Yahweh tells Moses something important. This is what Yahweh says to Moses. "I have remembered my covenant." This does not mean that Yahweh had forgotten his covenant and has now managed to remember what he said. What Yahweh means is this: he is now going to make his promise happen. Listen to what Yahweh says to Moses. I'm going to read Exodus chapter 6, verse 6. "Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. This is good news. This is the reassurance Moses needs. Yahweh will definitely keep his covenant. Yahweh will keep his super promise to give Abraham's family the promised land. To keep this promise, Yahweh will come and rescue his people from Egypt. In our story this week, Yahweh reassures Moses that he is the God who will keep his covenant. Even though it looked like everything had gone wrong, Yahweh tells Moses that the rescue from Egypt is definitely going to happen. Moses and the Israelites can trust that Yahweh always keeps his promises. After a few more grumbles, Moses goes back to Pharaoh to demand again that he let God's people go. Next week, we will find out what happens when Moses goes back to Pharaoh. Yahweh is still the same today. Yahweh hasn't changed. Just like Moses and the Israelites could trust Yahweh to do what he promised, so we can too. We can always count on Yahweh to do exactly what he says. Trusting Yahweh didn't make everything easy for Moses and the Israelites, and it doesn't make things easy for Christians today either. Christians can get upset and disappointed about how hard it can be to live as Christians. What we often need is reassurance from Yahweh. Christians can be reassured by remembering what Yahweh has promised them. Here are 2 things Christians should remember that Yahweh has promised. Number 1, Yahweh has promised a rescue. Christians aren't waiting to be rescued from Egypt. Yahweh has promised to rescue anyone who trusts in Jesus from the punishment of their sin. Number 2, the second thing we should remember is this: Yahweh has promised the new creation. Christians aren't waiting for Yahweh to take them to a small country here on earth like the Israelites were. Instead, we are waiting for Yahweh to bring a whole new world, a perfect and wonderful world without Satan or sickness or sin. Yahweh has promised a rescue and a new creation. Christians can be reassured by remembering these promises. We've been learning today that Yahweh always keeps his promises. Let's ask him to help us trust his wonderful promises, even when it's hard to be a Christian. We're going to hear more about who Yahweh is in the next episode. See you then.